Your next project is going to be on artists and their techniques, and this is going to be considered your research project for the class. For this project, you are going to create a work of art inspired by the artist that you choose. So you're not going to create an exact copy of the work. You are going to create a work that's either inspired by a specific technique of theirs, or maybe you're interested in a concept that their work is based around, something that it has to be based off of something that you learned about this artist through your research. You are also going to create a presentation that you will share with the class. Now, the presentation itself, you can make it in a PowerPoint or some other kind of shared document. There's also a app in Canvas called Studio that you could record it in. You could even do it in a Word document with some typed notes if you don't want to record yourself reading it, whatever you feel comfortable with. And we're going to share it in a later discussion post. But you're going to create a presentation that has to include images of the artist's work. It should contain also information on the artist's processes, so how they make their work. It should also include knowledge of major concepts or themes within their work itself. And you should also tell us why you chose this particular artist and how your piece was inspired by them. So I'm going to give a few examples of artists and talk about their work a little bit and how it might inspire you to create a work of your own. So the first one that I'm going to talk about is Chuck Close. He is what's considered part of the photorealist movement. As you can see, this is a painting of his that is very detailed down to each individual hair. Now, these are very large drawings or paintings. This is a graphite drawing, so you can kind of see them compared to Chuck Close there on the left. So that's one of the reasons he's able to get this huge amount of detail. But, it can be something that you're originally inspired by his work, by the beauty and detail of it, but I want you to dig a little deeper, actually figure out how he's went through and made some of these processes. Now, here's a color example of a painting that Chuck Close has done. And just want to kind of give you an example. This is called Linda. You can see this is actually how this is in the Akron Art Museum. This is how Linda's displayed. And on the left there's actually 5 little panels. And for this painting, he actually printed off the image, creating each single layer by itself. So he separated the image through Photoshop in the computer, or how not through Photoshop, obviously, because it wasn't invented yet, but the way that a printing press separates the color. So he took a computer, and with the printing press, he actually separated out each one of those colors the way you might print a photograph. So you can see he has there magenta, cyan, and yellow, sort of mimicking the process of full color printing. But he actually painted them through each one of those layers. And he's very interested in this idea of seeing painting as a mechanical process. Chuck Close, one of the reasons he started doing these large images is that he has a disorder that he cannot recognize people's faces. So if he looks at someone, he won't recognize you from one minute to the next. So he started painting his close friends so that he could actually understand how they look. So he saw this as a process that he could understand the details of someone's face and actually be able to recognize them. The other thing is this process. The reason these paintings are so detailed is because he uses such a mechanical process. So he grids out each one of these pieces. If it's in the black and white, he grids it out, methodically grids it out, so that everything is sort of the exact right proportion. He's very famously known for using the grid process if you're doing a drawing. Most of you who've had me have used the grid process before. Even in his colored pieces, he uses the grid process, and he actually went through, painted uh, the red layer, painted the yellow layer, painted the blue layer, each individually, until he came out with this very realistic skin tone. Later in life, he became disabled, actually through a virus that left him with unable to walk and limited movement in some of his arms. So he actually has started a different process, one of which he starts off with these sort of abstract color blocks, and he doesn't have the sort of control over his um, fine motor movements to paint the details that he used to. But it still comes off very realistically, right? Because he's looking at the overall colors and shapes. Each part is almost one of these little mini abstract paintings. And I think the interesting part is he starts with this colored ground using the same grid process, if you can see it there underneath. Just looking at the overall kind of tonal quality of it. And because he has some limited movement, he even has this big machine that lifts his canvases up and down for him. You can see he actually has a photograph there on his side, printed out and gridded, and he's got the tape piece going exactly where each little grid is that he wants to work off individually at a time. So he's still using a very methodical practice, even though he's limited in some of his physical abilities. He's still able to create a work that's very um, detailed and realistic in its own right. So it's kind of interesting how his process has remained similar, even though the end product is very different. The next artist that we're going to talk about is Leonardo da Vinci. Now, most of you have seen this work before, sort of the famous Mona Lisa, right? It's famous for a variety of reasons, some of which I'm sure if you've had an art history class before, um, you will know sort of the stories and the myths behind the Mona Lisa herself. The Mona Lisa, the painting, was stolen a couple times. It was famous for that. It was famous because it was considered one of the first paintings that exploited the use of oil paint. Um, it was famous because of the beauty of the softness of her skin, the glowing quality, um, the ability that he captured in the smile, right? There's this big variety of reasons. And I want to touch on just thinking about Da Vinci and some of the things that he actually invented in his processes that he started that are still used today. First of which was what's known as a grisaille underpainting process. Now, Da Vinci is known for his beautiful paintings, but he only ever completed 12 known works of art in his lifetime. If you see every once in a while in the news, you'll hear about there's a couple other paintings that may or may not be attributed to Da Vinci, including another Mona Lisa sort of look like. But there's many, many examples of works of his that are uncompleted. So you can actually see steps of his process, and see sort of how he would actually start an underpainting and build it. This piece has the underdrawing, so you can actually see the Madonna in middle and sort of on the left side in the figure there, where you can see where he's actually sketched in um, using metal point and gesso. You can see his underdrawing, those beginning phases. And then you can start to see the underpainting itself where he uses a brown and white grisaille process to map out all the tonal values. And over top of that, he would actually create his painting. And there's another whole controversy surrounding the Mona Lisa that oftentimes you'll see pop up, the idea, who was the actual Mona Lisa? There's some theory put into the idea that it's actually a self-portrait of Da Vinci that he made into a woman, because you can see similar facial features. Whatever it is, truth or no truth behind that, it is interesting that we, as artists, tend to take some of ourselves and put it into the painting. Um, and of course, at this time there wasn't a camera, and people can only sit still for so long. So, if you wanted to know how to draw a nose and what it looked like, a mirror was often what you'd have to use. So, um, was it purposeful that the Mona Lisa kind of looks like Da Vinci? Maybe so, maybe not. Maybe it's just something that happened as he was creating the piece. Jackson Pollock is an artist who has a lot of famous backstories, but he's also known for his process, right? If you've ever seen a Jackson Pollock, it's not necessarily about the work itself. They're sort of big, giant, messy pieces. He became well known for the fact that his pieces were considered actions or movements, that it was more about the dance that he created than the subject matter itself. So your process could be all about how you apply your materials to your support, right? Less about the final outcome, if that's what you decide. Norman Rockwell is another well-known artist who has very detailed processes that he would work with before creating a work of art. He's known for his very detailed paintings and drawings that often were featured on the covers of Life magazines. And they're also sort of seen as classic Americana. You see, uh, I'm sure you'll recognize some of these images as we go through a few of them. But Rockwell was also known for his very detailed use of models. So he had models that he used time and time again, often the same little boy or children, and he would set up lighting, he would set up exact poses. Oftentimes, he didn't make an exact replica of the photograph itself, but he would use that photograph to inform his lighting, his wrinkling of the clothing, often picking up on many of the details, but they weren't always exactly perfect. He would take artistic license to change certain specific details. So you can see a few of them there in this piece, the change of the boy's shirt, the hat of the man behind the counter, all those kinds of things he would often change. But the amount of care that he would put into those little details and setting up the photographs that he would work from his paintings were really amazing. Um, Even so much as if you're looking at the man here and getting the tattoo, he didn't like the way his legs were bent, so he would stick a couple books underneath them so they'd be up a little bit higher, so they would be um, properly bent in the way he wanted them in his composition. Um, this is kind of one of my favorite ones where he's sort of taking the image of the little girl and he wanted her hair flying back, so he'd have some women holding her hair back with a cape. Every little, no little detail went too far for him. Anselm Kiefer is another artist who's known for his processes. He is a German artist who is in some ways trying to grapple with the legacy of World War II and the Holocaust. So he's really interested on what that collective memory has done to German society. And oftentimes he uses materials that are meant to show sort of the either deterioration of society or sort of the remnants of what have been left over because of that, the pain of the Holocaust. So oftentimes, if you look at his paintings, they actually look like they're falling apart, and oftentimes they are. Um, I've visited the conservatorship in Cleveland Museum of Art. I did an internship there for a summer, and one of Kiefer's works was there. It had it's actually made out of salt or little bits of salt that he had mixed in with the paint. It had a very symbolic meaning to it, but the paint itself started to kind of trickle off the surface of the painting, and Anselm Kiefer didn't want that replaced. He saw that as part of the living process of the painting. He saw that as, a strong, would give his piece a strong conceptual meaning. So oftentimes he uses things, like I mentioned, salt. Other times he will actually use wood that he's taken from the actual pulled up railroad ties that used to take people to the concentration camps. He's very interested in this idea of material having a memory, so much so that he, same thing, has actually taken parts of the uh, of lead or pieces that were dismantled from Nazi tanks and melt them down and use them in lead in his pieces. So they're all meant to have a symbolic meaning to them. Jennifer Nairbass's pieces sort of reflect her own cultural interests and history. She worked for a while in sort of a glossy magazine editing fashion photography. So her pieces, they're paintings, but they are painted based off of collaged, photoshopped images. And she's really thinking about the idea. Oftentimes the images that we see in magazines and in advertising and in media are not reality, but are depicted as if they were reality, right? That they're sort of a false fabrication of it. So oftentimes she plays off of that idea. The figures themselves are painted very realistically. But so they're painted in the same manner that are the abstracted backgrounds that have been altered and changed through Photoshop. So she's sort of commenting on what do we find real, why are we sort of drawn to these particular images, um, and I think it's just sort of an interesting commentary on our media in general and how manipulated it is. James Goebel is an artist, actually a Bay Area artist, who's interested in depictions of masculinity. And his pieces, which he considers felt drawings, are actually designed using cut fabric and cut felt. So I know it's difficult to see. I have a close-up of them. Um, they're sort of like a line drawing, but each piece has been meticulously cut out of fabric and placed into its own little spot. So they're very clean, almost poster-like images that are actually extraordinarily detailed and refined. McLean Thomas is another artist who's interested in that use of fabric and fashion, and she uses some materials that you wouldn't normally see in fine art paintings and drawings. She oftentimes uses latex paint, and she uses uh, sort of the unconventional material of rhinestones and glitter. That's a close up so you can kind of see how they're all individually put into place there. And she's interested in representations of femininity in African Americans and projecting and embracing a strong, powerful image of women. So oftentimes she uses pattern and fabric and fashion as a uh, way to symbolize them. So, kind of getting back to thinking about your own piece, it's the idea that you're looking at them and you're sort of researching the background and how they were made. A very common one, I'll kind of bring this up because actually one of the projects that I typically have students from um, painting one is based around this idea. Typically at the end of the semester, we use the color ground technique. It's something that was invented with the Impressionists. If I was thinking about this as a student, I'd start to research into Monet's interest, how he often didn't do any preparatory drawing. He would start with a color ground, building paint, um, using sort of quick, fast strokes. Main fields of color were blocked in. I might research how he did different brushstroke techniques or impasto, wet on wet. Those are all based out of Monet's initial techniques. And then I would go and I would make a project of my own. So it wouldn't be a copy of one of Monet's pieces. It would actually be my own original piece using a wet on wet technique or impasto technique. So remember, you are picking images, you're thinking about what your artist or technique or process, how you're influenced by their work, and then you're going to share your work of art um, along with your final piece in your presentation.